I'm going to talk mainly about Afghanistan this evening. And the reason is that you may have missed it, but on October the 7th of this year, the United States completed 15 years of its current war in Afghanistan. 15 years. And it went by without really any consideration. The United States still has troops in Afghanistan, and in none of the presidential debates has the question of Afghanistan been raised. So Afghanistan has disappeared from the public discussion. And I think for that reason, I'm very interested in bringing it back, at least in our small settings, in our small circles. And I hope very much that you take some of these conversations to where you come from and hold them with people. Talk about, the roots of the Afghan war. And I hope I'll be able to provide you with at least something to think about, or some things to think about regarding the Afghan war, but not just the Afghan war, because after all, the Afghan war was the opening salvo in what was then called the global war on terror, and which the Obama administration has christened overseas contingency operations. I'm going to talk a lot about bureaucratic language, but I don't think there can be any more bureaucratic way of talking about a war than calling a war overseas contingency operations. It's a strikingly bureaucratic way to have us, or numb us, away from the actuality of what is happening, which is that, American soldiers are going abroad, American hardware is bombing from the skies, and we call these operations. And not only do we call these operations, we say they are contingent. I don't know what they're contingent on. I'm not sure if there's a timeline for these operations. After all, the global war on terror, which was authorized by a congressional authorization, was both timeless and spaceless. It opened the door for the executive branch to conduct wars anywhere, at any time, to basically erase terrorism, which is an extraordinary license given to the executive branch. So when you have the phrase like overseas contingent operations, you first reduced war to operations, and then you've raised this specter that perhaps these wars aren't timeless, they are contingent upon something. We don't know what they're contingent upon. Think about this. But let me begin first with a little poem from a young Afghan poet. She published a book about a year ago, Zarlasht Hafiz. She writes in Pashto, but this is it in English. The sorrow and grief, these black evenings, eyes full of tears and times full of sadness, these burnt hearts, the killing of youths. When I think of how to tell the story of the global war on terror from the standpoint of its victims, there are perhaps two ways to do it. The first way is to accumulate for you stories of suffering. There's a density to violence. There's a density to the impact of violence upon people. And I can stand here for the next 5, 6 hours, maybe longer, maybe the whole week. I can talk, filibuster your lives and talk for a week, telling you stories I've heard of people's tragedy. But here's just one of them. This is from the town of Rada, provincial town in Yemen, where Abdullah al-Amiri told this story. He was going for his wedding, and he said, that day we had lunch, ate and drank water, and headed to receive the bride. We were around 60 or 70 people in 12 cars. The mood was joyful. I was so pleased. I was surrounded by friends and family. I was happy. It was my wedding party. Then we were hit. It's striking. The statements are striking. They come almost in staccato. I was happy. We did this. We got in the car. And then we were hit. When a drone hits you, when a Hellfire missile from a drone hits you, there is no lead up to it. You're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, and then you're hit. And then 10 people are dead and 24 people are wounded. And Abdullah al-Amiri's life is devastated, destroyed. what struck the Al-Amiri caravan is known as a signature strike. In other words, what's interesting about the term signature is that the eyes in the sky, the operators, the CIA operators of these drones, observe patterns on the ground. You know, it's like stop and frisk. It's like racial profiling on a global scale. They observe from the sky that these cars are moving in an area where they say there is hot activity. In other words, they suspect Al-Qaeda activity in this part of Yemen, and there's cars driving along. Because they're cars, it gives off the signature of having terrorists in the convoy. So then there's a strike, a signature strike against those cars. Now, only later will you discover whether the signature was properly read, whether the tea leaves were correct. You know, there's no, in this case and in many of these cases, there is no ground level information. There is no informant on the ground telling you that in the Al-Amiri caravan, there is actually Al-Qaeda leadership. This is entirely from the skies, an observed pattern where there is a presumption that if cars are driving in a convoy, this is probably Al-Qaeda. So that means it's hard to tell the difference between a marriage party and an Al-Qaeda leadership convoy, which is, by the way, why so many marriage parties get struck in signature strikes. You see this from Waziristan out to Yemen. You know, every once in a while you'll hear a story about marriages being disrupted because marriages look like, from the sky, they look like convoys of terrorists. Striking problem. But again, let's go back to the language. It's a signature strike. When a strike takes place and when the Hellfire missile hits, it's called a touchdown. When somebody's killed, the operator types in EKIA, enemy killed in action. There is a kill chain. This is the vocabulary of the drone operator. There is a kill chain. There are what are called baseball cards, which have information on terrorists that need to be taken out. There is the double tap, where one Hellfire missile strikes, and when one Hellfire missile strikes, it draws people coming in to help the people who have been hit. In other words, people instinctively come to help people who are dying or who have been injured, to come and help them. At that point, the second missile strikes. It's called a double tap. And then, of course, there is that other great bureaucratic term, MAM, military age males. Again, this is part of the signature strike strategy. If you see MAMs from the sky, you can assume perhaps, if there are sufficient numbers of them. By the way, again, I just want to remind you, this is the global cognate of the city of Chicago's ordinance that said that if 2 or more gang members are associating, they can be asked to be dispersed. That's also, you know, an observation made by police officers. 3 people they think look like gang members, they tell them you can't talk to each other on the street. This is the global cognate of that. Well, look, if this is what's happening from the skies, it's useful for the CIA, for the US military, for the State Department even, to look at evidence of what's happening from the signature strikes. I mean, after all, if you're conducting several hundred of these, are you actually clearing the baseball cards? Are you killing the terrorists? Is the kill chain being shortened? This is a very rational thing that anybody would like to do, to investigate this. So there was an operation conducted in the AFPAC region, that is the borderlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and this operation was called Operation Haymaker. Now, Haymaker was conducted over several years, so the government studied what happened with Haymaker. And what the government found, this is a slide leaked by Edward Snowden, what the government found was that only 1 in 9 of people killed by these signature strikes could be thought to be terrorists. Remember, this is all conditional language. Could be thought to be terrorists, not confirmed kills. That means 8 out of 9 people in Operation Haymaker could not be thought to be terrorists. In other words, they were most likely civilians. So 8 of 9 people hit by drone strikes in AFPAC are most likely, by the government's own analysis, leaked again by Edward Snowden, by the government's own analysis, these are not good hits. You're killing civilians. If you're killing civilians, well, that's not good because you're riling up people in the area. I could, as I said, tell you these stories of suffering for hours and hours and hours, but that's only one way to approach the landscape of the global war on terror. There's another way, which is what I'm going to spend most of my next, I don't know, what do we say, 2.5 hours talking about, which is to tell the story of the global war on terror from the perspective of the people who are most impacted by it. In other words, civilians on the ground. What do these civilians see? Do they see October 7th, 2001 onward, the period when the global war on terror begins in its Afghanistan and Pakistan sector? Do they see this in the same way as people in the United States see the global war on terror? I mean, it's I think a reasonable question to ask. There is a global war on terror. US assets are being deployed. Many young American men and women are going to fight in this global war on terror. Do people in the United States see this global war on terror in the same way as people who are waiting, eating, drinking, getting in a car, driving, and then we were hit? Is there a similarity of experience? Well, of course not, because they are experiencing in certain pockets of this geography, which is most impacted by the global war on terror, they're experiencing massive and incomprehensible levels of violence. And everywhere that I have been, everywhere one goes, whether it's from Afghanistan to Libya, the question people ask is, why us? This is like the question. You hear this all the time. Why us? Why are we getting hit? So let's think about why they are getting hit. Of course, 9/11 happens, and 9/11 is a grotesque attack in the United States. Very soon thereafter, a decision is made, and I'm going to talk about this decision-making process toward the end, but a decision is made to go and attack Afghanistan. The bombardment of Afghanistan after October 7th, 2001 was incredibly violent. It was immense force. In fact, good estimates, and these estimates of death and refugees are very hard to calibrate. Partly, there is no forensic data. There are no morgues that you can go to collect information on who is dead in Paktia province. Where are you going to go to collect dead? So there are various ways in which people calculate the death. One is the unusual mortality. If this is the mortality rate, you assume the population will be here, and suddenly there's a decline. In the first 4 months after October 7, 2001, one of the estimates of mortality is that 20,000 people had been killed. In 4 months, 20,000 people have been killed. It's extraordinarily high. There are lower levels which suggest that 3,800 had been killed. So somewhere between 3,800 to 20,000 Afghans died in the first 4 months of the war. The bombing was extraordinarily spectacular in parts of the country. Something to think about. Over the last 16 years, 500,000 Afghans have been killed. That's a very high number. That's the same number that is used as the estimate for the dead in Syria. 500,000 killed. There's global revulsion about what's happening in Syria, but strikingly, there is no concern about Afghanistan. 500,000 dead in Afghanistan. I don't see any press coverage. I don't see any concern about the civilians. It's just not there. There are about 3 million Afghan refugees at present. But listen to this. Between 2002 and 2015, that means after the war had begun, after the first phase of bombing, and until recently, 5.8 million Afghan refugees have been sent back into Afghanistan. Why? Because Pakistan is not a signatory of the 1951 Convention on Refugees, and it just simply cannot hold the number of refugees that it's holding. So it is encouraging people to go back into essentially a very dangerous war zone. Previously, there were almost negligible numbers of Afghan refugees entering Europe. See, again, there is the Mediterranean crisis that you've been following and the crisis of refugees through Greece. But the attention is paid to Syria. I don't think you know that last year, 178,000 Afghan refugees entered Europe. And we don't know how many died on the way, because they have to go not just from Syria to Lampedusa, or from Syria to Lesbos. They have to go from Afghanistan through Iran, across Iraq, imagine this, across Syria, north into Turkey. I mean, this is perilous landscape. So 178,000 Afghans last year entered Europe. There is every indication that this year the numbers will be higher. They're already higher than they were last year. They're already higher. In Iran and Afghanistan, there are about 1 million Afghan refugees in Iran. There are almost 2 million Afghan refugees in Iraq, in Pakistan, and many of these are second and third generation refugees. Keep this in mind. I'm going to come back to this. There's been a 35 to 40 year period of refugee production from Afghanistan. It's important to understand that. So there's this massive bombardment of Afghanistan, enormous loss of life. What did the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda people do? Did they sit around and wait to be bombed? I mean, here's one of the real irrationalities of heavy aerial bombardment. It assumes that the fighters that you want to get on the ground are going to wait there for you to bomb them. I mean, I'll just give you a parenthetical story. When the United States started bombing near Raqqa in Syria, most of the Europeans who came to join ISIS immediately turned tail, crossed Turkey, went back to Europe, and then you had the Paris attack. Then you had the Brussels attack. I mean, it's when the bombing started in Raqqa and the regions of Raqqa that the Europeans went home. You know, the European jihadis were the most brutal in Syria. They were the ones who were doing most of the brutal executions. They went back to Europe. I mean, that's a European problem. That's not really a Syrian problem. So when you do heavy bombardment, in 2002, a CIA operative told me, he said that, you know, one of our errors is we took the biggest hammer we could find and smashed the vial of mercury. And, you know, the mercury just went all over the planet. In other words, Al-Qaeda people, Taliban, not the Taliban so much, the Al-Qaeda people went home. They went to Libya, they went to the Philippines, and instead of being in Afghanistan, they started again their various groups, whether it's, you know, in Mindanao Island in the Philippines, or whether it's a Libyan Islamic fighting group in Libya. They went home. He said it was a big error to hit them hard with a hammer. Could have corralled them. That was the CIA man's thinking. They fled for Pakistan, or the Taliban went back to their villages where they began to regroup. We'll come back to them. A government was parachuted in to Kabul, sanctified in Bonn, Germany. Now, this government is interesting. It was made up largely of old mujahideen. I'm going to come back to this word. It's an important word. These are basically the anti-communist fighters of the period from 1978 until, you know, basically 96, when the Taliban was established in Afghanistan, this long period. These anti-communist fighters came back to government. Now, the United States went to war saying we've come to crush Al-Qaeda, but they also said we've come to bring democracy to Afghanistan. Some of you may remember this. Laura Bush made a couple of speeches saying we've come to help women. I remember in 2003, a very fine Afghan politician by the name of Malalai Joya, who later came on tour in the United States to speak about Afghanistan, a very brave woman. Malalai Joya stood up in the Loya Jirga in 2003, basically the kind of parliament of the new government. And in the Loya Jirga, very brave. I mean, you know, honestly, these are people that we should see as our heroes. You know, the bravery that they show, but nobody cares about them. Malalai stood up and she said the following. She said, she pointed at the people in the room and said, why would you allow criminals to be in the Loya Jirga? She said, warlords are responsible for our country's situation. I mean, this woman is crazy. Because these were criminals, gangsters, warlords. They could have killed her like this. In fact, they were going to subsequently try. She was physically ejected from the Loya Jirga. She was thrown out. Very quickly, by 2003, all this discussion about women's rights, democracy, all disappeared. Meanwhile, another vocabulary had become more important in the conversations of the Afghan political class and other people as well. This was a different vocabulary. This was a vocabulary, and if you have paper and interested in this, you should write these words down. This was vocabulary of enemy combatants. This was vocabulary of night raids, where people were going in and being grabbed from their houses. This was vocabulary of black sites. This was vocabulary of the so-called JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. And a story comes out later. I'll just give you one story just to illustrate this. This was in Paktia province, where, again, it was a wedding celebration in this house, and one of the men in the house worked for the Afghan police. He was quite a well-regarded man in the Afghan police. A JSOC group had intelligence that this was a gathering of terrorists. They arrived with heavy force. When there was a lot of noise outside, when the marriage party people came out to see, JSOC fired on them, and 7 people were killed. 2 of them turned out were pregnant women. Now, this is not even the most interesting part of this story. Okay, they were killed. There was no terrorists there. In fact, as I said, it was the house of an Afghan police officer. But then the JSOC people did something peculiar. And, you know, this is bad luck. This is a little bit like the whole Black Lives Matter thing, because the Afghans had cell phones, and they filmed a lot of this. So what the JSOC people were doing, and they had removed their name tags, which is always an interesting moment. But they were going into the 7 bodies and digging out the bullets. Very interesting. There was a study done by JSOC of this incident, which found that the use of force is appropriate. So nobody had to face anything. In fact, the JSOC commanding officer came to this village, came back to the village, and they sacrificed a sheep and tried to make amends, you know, saying we're sorry that they were killed. But the use of force was appropriate. Now, whether this incident is an illustrative one or not is not relevant to me. What's relevant to me is that it's these kinds of incidents that creates an understanding of what this war is about. People don't see that the presence of the United States in Afghanistan, they don't see it building schools or women's rights or things like that. What they generally see is there is a moment of fear in these kind of incidents. Could it happen now? Because remember the language of Abdullah Amiri. He says, I was happy, it was my wedding party, then we were hit. It comes from nowhere. And that's what I think is really quite terrifying. Now, of course, this was not all. This vocabulary of black sites, the vocabulary of, you know, night raids, the vocabulary of enemy combatant, of Bagram Air Base, of the kind of things that were happening there. I recommend you watch a documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side, which was made by the son of a former Pomona professor. Anyway, Alex Gibney? Didn't Gibney teach somewhere here?
His father runs a Pacific Basin Institute.
That's it. I knew there was a connection. Pacific Basin Institute was his father. What was his father's name also? Something? Yeah, so Alex Gibney is the filmmaker. So that film is extraordinary. It's called Taxi to the Dark Side. I really recommend it. It's not only that this vocabulary is in play, as well, the United States spent, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, on so-called reconstruction and development. Okay. Stanley McChrystal, very respected officer, decided when he was trying to reconstruct the counterinsurgency model to do a study of the expenditure of this hundreds of millions of dollars for reconstruction and development. And this is what McChrystal's report said. He said, too often these projects enrich power brokers, corrupt officials, or international contractors. They serve only limited sections of the population. You know, there was a guy who was being, you know, talking about these development projects, and his line was the best line ever. His line was, we may be illiterate, but we're not stupid. You know, we may not know how to read, but we can see what's going on. You know, we're suddenly told that 8 schools are going to be built in this district, but there is no school. There's a building set up, there's a sign, but there's no school. There's no teaching, there's no money to continue the school. The shell is created by some subcontractor, international subcontractor that takes the money and then builds these shells, takes pictures, and then disappears. There's a film recently about 2 arms dealers in Iraq. I didn't see it. I saw the ad for it. But it's that kind of hustle. If you want to read a book, Iraq is a good place to read it. And that's Rajiv Chandrasekharan's book, which is called Inside the Green Zone. Emerald City is the name of the book. It's about corruption in Iraq. It's a terrific book. So hundreds of millions of dollars basically squandered. And here's Stanley McChrystal's report saying these projects basically did little. World Bank, meanwhile, had started writing reports about the need to use American troops to secure resource corridors. This is their phrase, resource corridors. In other words, from the mines, copper mines, there should be infrastructure built, which American troops, American lives have to protect these corridors so that copper can come out of these corridors and multinational corporations can benefit. And the theory from the World Bank is the sale of these resources would bring some assets into the exchequer in Kabul. That was the theory. Really, it was quite obscene that this is where they were going at the time when there was almost no basic development project that was functioning. They moved already to resource corridors. A social worker from the Development Council in Balkh, which is near the Uzbek border, she said, people living in such conditions are easily susceptible to manipulation by the Taliban. She's a smart person. She said this in 2005, and in 2006, the Taliban returns. Now, I'll come back to the return of the Taliban. Are we okay? You're following the story? There's a lot of information, but this is really a buried story. That's why I'm wasting your time. I want to bring you back to speed on the Afghan tale, okay? As you know, of course, history doesn't begin on 9/11. There was a history before 9/11. There is a past. And Afghanistan, as some of you may know, is not merely a synonym for Al-Qaeda. It has its own history, which I think is important to bear in mind. When you want to look at history from the standpoint of the victim, it's important to take their history seriously. You know, I'm always surprised by people who talk about Libya but know nothing about the country. You know, the word Benghazi now is used as a discussion, I mean, about the US presidential campaign, but Benghazi is actually a real city. You know, it's a little bit like how they used to talk about Timbuktu in the early colonial period. You know, Timbuktu became this fanciful place, right? Timbuktu is a real city in Mali. It actually exists. There are really people who live in Timbuktu. It's not a fantasy place, you know. In the same way, Afghanistan is a real country. It has a real history. There are real people. In 1973, there was a coup against the king. King Zahir Shah, who was rather an enfeebled king, was sent off to Rome, where he sat for the next 30-odd years playing chess. It's one of his great pastimes. Now, the abdication or removal of Zahir Shah of Afghanistan is part of a process of removing monarchies that starts with the Soviet Revolution in Central Asia, where they kind of remove feudal chiefs, but has its real beginning for this dynamic in the removal of the king of Egypt in 1952 by the officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Nasserist movement, the Arab nationalist movement. They started a new process of getting rid of kings. That was the king in Egypt, then a king in Iraq is removed, then later a king in Libya in '69. And the king of Afghanistan, when Zahir Shah is overthrown, he's overthrown by his cousin. And Muhammad Daud, when he comes to power, Muhammad Daud Khan is very much driven by a kind of modernist agenda. So his reign is going to last from 1973, and it's very much part of this global, you know, move to get rid of kings and bring a kind of modernist agenda to places held back by colonial rule. You know, Afghanistan never given a chance. If you read the histories of British entry into Afghanistan, the level of brutality is stunning. I mean, in a sense, much greater than anything that's happened in recent decades. Okay. His period, Muhammad Daud Khan's period, runs from 1973 to 78, when the communists take over, and the communists will govern essentially till 1992. So for almost 20 years, 18 years, this modernist agenda is, on the surface at least, governing in Afghanistan. Now, this modernist agenda is important, because I'm going to give you some statistics in a little bit. But the coup that takes place, the second coup, first coup is in 73, gets rid of the king. Second coup that takes place, the Saur coup, takes place in April of 1978, when the communists take power, happens because Muhammad Daud Khan decides to get rid of the communists, and he goes after Mir Akhtar Khyber. The assassination of Mir Akhtar Khyber sends a message to the communists in Afghanistan, we're coming after you. This is an interesting thing, because again, you can go back to West Asian history, put Afghanistan back into West Asian history. In 1978, this is exactly what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, when Saddam led how many coups did the Ba'ath do? The auto coups, they kept coupping against themselves. When Saddam finally comes to power in Iraq, what does Saddam do? Saddam goes after the communists. At that time, the Communist Party of Iraq was the strongest political party in Iraq. In fact, when Qasim comes to power in 1958, he turns to the Communist Party of Iraq and says, will you help me govern? We are officers. We don't know the first thing about governing. We don't know the first thing about politics. At that time, the Soviets told the Iraqi communists, don't seize power. Work in a popular front with these Iraqi nationalists led by Qasim. Actually, the communists could have done a revolution in Iraq in 1958. They could have gone from overthrowing the king to seizing power, but they didn't. They held back. That was their undoing, because 20 years later, Saddam decimated the Communist Party. Now, you have to understand that that message of Iraq was very clearly heard by the Parcham and Khalq branches of the Afghan communist movement, of the People's Democratic Republican Party. They very well knew the history of Iraq. In fact, when I interviewed some of the leadership of that party when they went into exile, I asked them specifically, what was the Iraq experience to you? And said that was foundational. When Mir Akhtar Khyber was killed, we said they're going to come after all of us. So they conduct the April Revolution, the Saur Revolution in 1978. And they come to power. Now, why did I say that this is a period of modernization, a modernist agenda? Because the communists shared a lot with Daud Khan, with Muhammad Daud Khan. What they shared was an agenda towards labor rights. For the cousin of the king, he was an extraordinarily expansive, open-minded man. They shared labor rights, they shared agricultural reform, and they shared women's rights. Now, when the communists came to power, they passed a series of decrees, harsh decrees in a way. One of them, most harsh decree, most unacceptable decree, was they said, women and men have the same rights in divorce. Then they said, women have a right to property. Then they said, women have a right to education. This was like, how could this be done? Now, who was saying that this was unacceptable? It was the US Embassy in Islamabad. I'm going to come back to them in a minute. We always say, why can't there be a coup in America? And the answer is, there's no American embassy in America. So you always look, what's going on in the US Embassy? What are the conversations? Okay. So when I asked one of the leaders of the Afghan movement at the time, Anahita Ratebzad, who died 2 years ago in Dortmund in Germany, very fine person. She was one of the top leaders of the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And she said, she gave 3 statistics. She said that during the early years, because they pushed this agenda of women's rights, they understood that and by the way, this is a resource-driven agenda, not necessarily a feminist agenda. Although she was a feminist, they understood that half the population was so-called underutilized. So by the high point of the communist rule in the mid-1980s, about 5-6 years into their governance, even though this war is going to begin, 50% of civil servants in Afghanistan were women. 40% of doctors were women. And most strikingly, 70% of teachers were women. If you travel to Afghanistan in that era, and then you travel now, they are unrecognizable places. There, the left was in ascendancy. Interesting discussion takes place, as I said, in the Islamabad embassy. Under Secretary of Defense Walter Slocum visits the region and comes back, and he writes the following. He says there's a value in keeping the Afghan insurgency going and sucking the Soviets into a Vietnamese quagmire. 2 things here. 1, keep the Afghan insurgency going, to weaken the communist government, because the communist government was seen as a threat. Remember, the revolution in Iran hadn't happened as yet. Iran was still a US ally. And Afghanistan, being a communist country right next to Iran, was seen as a major threat to the oil lands. So keep the Afghan insurgency going. I'm going to talk about this in a second, the Afghan insurgency. Secondly, find a way to raise the price for this communist government, that they have to ask the Soviets to help them, and then we'll put the Soviets into Vietnam. Now remember, this is 1978. This is 3 years after the United States withdrew from Vietnam. So the scars of Vietnam, the loss in Vietnam was very, very fresh. And now the idea was, we got burnt in Vietnam, let's throw the Soviets into Vietnam. So who did the United States start to help? By the way, the United States began its covert aid to these allies. The opening of the covert aid in July of 1979. Soviets didn't come until December of 79. So the aid didn't come after the Soviet entry. The Soviet entry actually came in response to the American aid, Saudi aid, Pakistani aid, etc. Who did they back? Remember I said it's scandalous that they did all these things on women's rights. The United States discovered that the leading lights in Afghanistan were men like Burhanuddin Rabbani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, most badly named person, because Gulbuddin is a beautiful name. If you know Pashto, it's a gorgeous name, in Farsi as well. You know, these are names that come from poetry. This is the most despicable guy, I'll tell you in a second. Burhanuddin Rabbani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Horrible people. Ahmad Shah Massoud feted by the French Parliament. When they were university students, when Massoud and Hekmatyar were university students in Kabul University, Hekmatyar then led the Hizb-e Islami, later he'll form his own branch. They used to think it was a perfectly acceptable thing to carry around bottles of acid and throw it in the faces of unveiled girls. Oh, okay, go back, put your veil on, you know, perfectly acceptable. These were the men that the United States decided were the people they would fund. These were marginal people with absolutely no social power. They had no social base. Burhanuddin Rabbani was a professor who had some linkages with his very, very reactionary political ideas, especially in the countryside. He had created networks. But these were not powerful people. But the United States, Saudis, Pakistanis decided to back them. So I've been saying Saudis and Pakistanis twice. In 1969, in response to the creation of the non-aligned movement, which was created in 1961, filled with Nasserites, third world nationalists, etc., in 1969, the bloc of countries in this region that despised third world nationalism, from Morocco to Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, created the Organization of Islamic Countries. That was created in 1969. The express purpose of the OIC was to undermine the NAM. You know, they are very clear about that. The NAM was a deep threat to their countries. This had to be the weapon to undermine it. And for years, the OIC countries had tried to find a lever underneath world history to put their feet in. The Saudis, in the 50s, had created a group called the World Muslim League, where they were propagandizing across the world against nationalism and communism. And they were making the case that Islam and democracy is antithetical. You cannot have Islam with democracy. You know, you had to have monarchy and Islam. It's a totally nonsensical idea, but it was their idea. And at this period, it had no traction. Nobody was listening to them. By the way, the bulk of the world's Muslims live in South Asia and in Southeast Asia. Between Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, that's the bulk of the world's Muslims. They were not interested in monarchy. But the Saudis were interested in propagating monarchical ideas. And they joined the Americans in this battle in Afghanistan, a great way to push their agenda. Now, at the same time, again, this is 1978, the major, most dramatic force that had emerged in the Arab world was the Palestinian resistance on this end of Asia. And the Palestinian resistance had now moved to a guerrilla war against Israel, against the occupation of their lands. And they called themselves the Fedayeen. You know, those who are willing to be sacrificed for their faith. By faith, they didn't mean religion always. After all, the Fedayeen were not religious in that sense. Their fida was to their revolution, it was to their nationalism. Even the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the communist Palestinians, they also call themselves Fedayeen. What they meant, we have fidelity to our cause. In the Hindu Kush mountains, the Saudis and others didn't want the term Fedayeen to be used for these new fighters. See, these fighters were going to now come and fight the Afghan communist government. They were going to draw in the Soviet Union, then they were going to fight the Soviet Union. But they didn't want them to be called Fedayeen. They used a much older word to describe them. They called them the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen has a completely different valence to Fedayeen. Mujahideen are those who are there to do jihad. They bring back the whole vocabulary of jihad, which had not been around for a very long time, back onto the stage of politics, not religion, onto the stage of politics. The Soviets enter in 1979, and we don't have time for all this, but there's a very interesting document of the Politburo meeting where the Politburo did not want to intervene in Afghanistan. They really didn't. They knew they would get sucked into a conflict that they were going to get hammered in. But they did enter. Now, you might think that the Soviets were there for like 100 years, the way people talk about this. The Soviets were there from December 1979 to February 1989. In other words, they were there for 9 years. We have just completed 15 years of the US presence in Afghanistan. They were there for 9 years. When they left in 1989, the communists remained in power in Kabul until 1992, a full 3 years afterwards. So they actually weren't relying on the Soviets. They had their own ability to stay in power. But yet, despite the fact that the Soviets pulled out, the Mujahideen was putting much more pressure on Kabul. At this time, Osama bin Laden brings his people into Afghanistan. Now, bin Laden comes to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. So at the tail end of the Soviet period, he arrives through Peshawar. He's got his guru there, Abdullah Azam, a teacher who had taught in the Gulf and had been quite influential. And by the way, in Lebanon now, there's Abdullah Azam Brigade, which is a very weird thing. The Abdullah Azam was his guru. They come and he then coins the term Al-Qaeda, the base camp of discussion of how to propagate this war. At that time, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was only anti-communist. Later, when he goes to the Saudis and says, let me help you get rid of the Iraqi army from Kuwait after August 2nd, 1980 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, at that time, when the king of Saudi Arabia tells bin Laden, get out of here, you're an idiot, and then invites the Americans to come into Saudi Arabia, that bin Laden starts to become anti-American. In the earlier period, he's not anti-American. In fact, he works with the CIA in Afghanistan. There's no problem. He's building roads and caves and things, logistical pathways for the Mujahideen. This Mujahideen, by the way, that now comes back to power after 2001. Remember I said they born in Germany, there's a meeting and then they come back to power. They now fight a civil war amongst each other that lasts between 1992 and 1996. This is famously called the Siege of Kabul, where Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, using SAM missiles, shoulder-held missiles, and various kinds of mortar devices, shells Kabul. More people died in the Siege of Kabul than during the war when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. It's an amazing thing. The delegitimacy of the Mujahideen in this period was extraordinary. It's because they were so brutal as people personally, but also the way they conducted their war, that the Taliban swept through the country. The Taliban was a creation of Pakistani intelligence, but also they were people who were students. That's why they were called Taliban. They were the Talibs. These students, they were studying in schools, madrasas, funded by Gulf Arabs and others. And they swept through because the population was completely disenchanted with the Mujahideen. They wanted them gone. Years later, one of the great Saudi diplomats, Fazl al-Turki said a story where he arrived in Jalalabad airport and all these Talibs came running to embrace him. And he was, I'm not a celebrity, why are you embracing me? And they said, you don't understand. We studied in the madrasa that you financed. Personally, you had financed our school. We look up to you as a hero. So these were the Talibs. They arrive. Because this Mujahideen was so brutal, they come in. It is in this period, and we can come back to this later, that Al-Qaeda utilizes Afghanistan as its base. We'll come back to that later. Now, I'll be done in a few minutes. 9/11 happens. This was the backstory. 9/11 happens. But was the global war on terror inevitable? Was it necessary? Were there other alternative ways to have done things? After Al-Qaeda struck in the United States, the group called the Shanghai Regional Cooperation, SCO, or the Shanghai Group, which comprises Central Asian countries and China, it had been formed in the 1990s because they were scared of the influence of the Taliban. Uzbekistan was scared that the Taliban was promoting a group called the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and destabilizing the valleys that lead up, the Fargana Valley that leads up from Afghanistan into Uzbekistan. So the Uzbeks were worried. The Chinese were worried that the Taliban had an influence in Western China, in Xinjiang province. So they had created the Shanghai Group as a way to have regional discussions of what to do about containing the Taliban. So after 9/11, the Shanghai Group approached the Americans and said, is there any way we can be a regional force to try to deal with the Taliban? And the Americans said, we are not interested. Secondly, the Afghan government of the Taliban, that means Mullah Omar, the one-eyed leader of the Taliban who had cloaked himself with the shawl of the Prophet, Mullah Omar sent a message to Washington saying, we are prepared to hand over the Al-Qaeda leadership, but this is interesting. But there are extradition laws. And we would like you to send us a dossier that shows the implication of bin Laden in the crimes of 9/11. And you can imagine the Bush administration seeing this pathetic little country demanding extradition laws be followed. You see what comes afterwards. What is an extradition law to extraordinary rendition? I mean, the ridiculousness of the proposal, it was dismissed. Imagine if at the time the government had said, okay, let's play this game. It's now September 25th, 2001. We'll fax you a dossier. They have fax machines in Kabul. We'll fax you a dossier of the implication of bin Laden. We'll go through some discussion, and by October 7th, you have to turn him over. Imagine if they had turned him over in 2007. How many less people would have died in Afghanistan? You know, because of something that happens in a second that I'm going to tell you about. Because after all, what this war did was remove the Taliban from power. It didn't destroy Al-Qaeda. Remember, used a heavy hammer, so Al-Qaeda spread all over. And bin Laden was killed in his miserable exile 10 years later. Not then. There was no trial, there was no evidence, there was no interesting discussion about how 9/11 happened. In fact, people in the United States still don't know the backstory of 9/11. We're still discussing the Saudi role, remember? 28 pages revealed a new congressional law that allows Saudi Arabia to be seen as financially obligated to victims, etc. We're still discussing this. This is now 15 years later. Imagine if this other history had been allowed to be opened. Don't say that that's idealistic and stupid, because that was possible. That was a door that was closed quite dramatically. Why do I say things are like they were on September 12th, 13th, 14th, 2001? Because the Taliban is back. And this is the other untold story of the present. The Taliban controls 3/4 of the districts in the province of Helmand, where the United States did the big surge. And in fact, the capital of Helmand, Lashkar-Gah, is under threat of being taken by the Taliban. Taliban has twice in the last calendar year taken the city of Kunduz in the north. Taliban controls most of the countryside. It's basically back. It's only a matter of time before the mayor of Kabul, which is the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, is removed from power. You know, it's only a matter of time. Meanwhile, Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, who basically governs, as I said, Kabul, has made a peace agreement, not with the Taliban, who are not interested in peace. They are going to win Kabul. He's made a peace agreement with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Mr. Acid in the face. So what's the point of 15 years of war? Because you're back to the situation with the Taliban substantially in power, with this small leadership in Kabul, the liberals under Ashraf Ghani, making a deal with the repellent elements of the Mujahideen. What were those 15 years for? Why not have negotiated for the extradition of bin Laden and picked up Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in 2001 from the Pakistanis, who very well knew where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was. He was hiding in a safe house in Karachi. Why not have dealt with it then? Carlotta Gall wrote a terrific book. She was a New York Times correspondent in Afghanistan called The Wrong Enemy. Why didn't the government put pressure on Pakistan in 2001? Just as a thought, on Saudi Arabia in 2001. What was the need to go to war in Iraq in 2003, which had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda? Think about the logic of what was possible and which doors were closed. Forget the question of whether the war is good or bad. From the standpoint of the victims, they are asking, did you really need to come and kill us? Let me just quickly tell you one more little story, and I'll end with this. One of the big errors is to assume that somehow Afghanistan is naturally a backward, right-wing, Islamic, whatever, I don't know, whatever adjectives you want to use. This is a huge error. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that very region from Waziristan up north, that is the northern part of Pakistan, the so-called tribal areas, up north into Jalalabad, Kandahar, almost to the borderlands of Kabul. In that region, in this period, 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was a group that was formed called the Khudai Khidmatgars, the servants of God. They were also called Surkh Posh, the red shirts. Their leader was a man called Badshah Khan, or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Now, this movement, Khudai Khidmatgars, believed in the principle of nonviolence. They were Gandhians. And they also believed in the ideas of socialism. Now, the British violence against the Khudai Khidmatgars was quite fierce, especially in the 1940s. They went after them during the so-called Quit India movement after 1942. When Pakistan was created in 1947, they got it in the neck from the Pakistani government. This is not a well-known thing, but Pakistan and Afghanistan don't have a border. They have a disputed border from the beginning. They didn't recognize each other in 1947. They have had a dispute that goes from 47 onwards. It's a so-called Durant line. The English, they went all over the world and drew lines. They drew a line to divide India and Pakistan, but they'd also previously divided Afghanistan and Pakistan with this Durand line. That was drawn right through the middle of the Pashto-speaking people. So the Khudai Khidmatgars saw themselves as not needing to, accept the line. So they faced an enormous crackdown. They were made illegal. In 1970, when the Khudai Khidmatgars were destroyed, the government of Pakistan legalized them. After they had been destroyed, they legalized them. But that's not even relevant. Here's where I want to end. In 1988, and I remember this vividly because it was an incredible moment. In 1988, when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the leader of the Khudai Khidmatgars, Badshah Khan, when he died in Peshawar, in Pakistan. But he was from Jalalabad in Afghanistan. And his followers and his family were keen that Badshah Khan be buried in Jalalabad, not in Peshawar. So they requested everybody. They were in the middle of a brutal war in Afghanistan, and Pakistan was involved. They said, can we take his body to Jalalabad to be buried? Every gun was silent for the few days it took for the funeral procession to go from Peshawar through the Khyber Pass to Jalalabad. Every gun was silent. President Najibullah, who was later lynched on the streets of Kabul by the Taliban right in front of a UN compound, came to the funeral. Afghanistan was silent on the day of his funeral. Thousands of people followed the body across the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan. Nobody checked their passport. They came to bury their leader. What they were really burying was their past. Afghanistan had a great past. Today, it has no future. And really, we are part of taking their future away from them. Thanks a lot.